Starting now. There we go. So one more, talking about medications for major depressive disorder. If an SSRI doesn't work, there's a new class of medications called SNRIs that prevent the reuptake of not only serotonin, but norepinephrine. So they work on two chemical systems of the brain, and they're kind of, if someone's depression is refractory, in other words, doesn't respond well to an SSRI, then you'll try one of these. You don't want to usually start out with one of these because we're working with two chemical systems of the brain, and if something goes wrong, you don't know which thing you're looking at. So usually start with an SSRI and then go try an SNRI. So what do you use to treat bipolar disorder? These are major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder. Bipolar disorder is usually treated with a combination of things that are mood stabilizers. Lithium was the old school mood stabilizer and was very effective in treating bipolar. The problem with bipolar disorder, the problem with lithium is it's got a very narrow therapeutic range. In other words, too little does nothing, and too much can become toxic and affect your kidneys. So lithium is very hard to manage. It's very effective, but it's hard to manage, which is why you don't hear much about it anymore. So now we have these new other mood stabilizers like Depakote or Lamictal, which were actually invented as anticonvulsants, anti-seizure medications. Somehow we found out that they're very effective in stabilizing mood as well. Now, here's the problem with, also with bipolar. So it's a mood stabilizer plus an antipsychotic, because sometimes in the manic phase of bipolar disorder, you have crazy thoughts and even hallucinations. So we use an antipsychotic, which we'll talk about when we talk about schizophrenia, and usually an antidepressant. So bipolar, it's usually a cocktail of three different medications. Now here's the big problem is compliance with bipolar disorder. When people are manic-y, they feel great. So they say, I feel wonderful. And they go for, days and days without sleep, and they have all this energy, and they say, I feel great. I don't need this medication anymore, and they throw it out. But then inevitably they hit that wall of depression, and they're begging for medication again. So compliance is a big issue for people being treated for bipolar disorder. When they're in the manic phase, they don't like taking medication. They don't feel like they need it. Now, Mary's going to talk about if someone has one of these mood disorders, and they're trying to be a disciple, what will they struggle with the most? Now here, I want to say something here about the interface between sin and these disorders. So a big question always to us is does this person really have the disorder, or is it just an excuse for sinful behavior? And sometimes there's that interface that's hard to define. Now, Mary and I will tell you, of all the disorders we talk about today, with the possible exception of one, schizophrenia alters your perception of reality and can make you do things that you think are right but that are actually wrong. With the exception of schizophrenia, none of these disorders make you sin, cause you to sin. Now, certain disorders predispose you to certain sins. For example, bipolar disorder, you're predisposed to sexual acting out, or you're predisposed to financial irresponsibility, or to certain spiritual problems. But what we like to emphasize is that even if you have a disorder, at every turn, you have a choice to do the right thing or the wrong thing. Even if you have bipolar disorder in the midst of a manic episode, if you have a foundation in the Bible, you know what's right and wrong, and at some point you're going to make a choice whether to do it or not. And it's hard to fight the compulsion, but there's always a choice to do good and do evil. Now, Mary's going to talk about some of those spiritual struggles.
I want to talk to you about just what disciples struggle with who have some of these disorders, and try to give you guys some practicals on how you can help people. I mean, you're not going to be prescribing the medications for them, but there are definitely some things you can do to help brothers and sisters who are dealing with some of these disorders. With people who have a depressive disorder, one of the things they battle with the most is negative thinking, especially about themselves. You know, a lot of times they feel like failures. They feel very worthless. They feel, like Michael said, they feel helpless. They feel like things are never going to get any better. Very hopeless about ever feeling better. And this is what leads some people to suicide with depression. You know, you at a certain level of severity in depression, people do have suicidal thoughts, and then you have that coupled with this feeling of I'm a failure anyway, and it's never going to get any better. You know, that's what leads people to suicidal actions. You know, you can talk to somebody that's depressed about taking captive every thought all day long, and they're not going to be able to do it. You know, try as they might, those depressive thoughts are going to come in on them. You know, those thoughts of worthlessness and I'm a failure and those kind of things. One of the things you can do to help people who are dealing with a depressive disorder is help them identify that those thoughts are part of the illness. Those thoughts are part of the illness. They are not real. You know, for a number of years in my practice, I saw, especially women who were working in the ministry, had worn themselves out. By the time they hit my office, they were very depressed. They were often had some physical illnesses as well from just physically wearing themselves out. And some of them would sit there and, you know, women who've been in the ministry leading churches for 10 or 20 years, and they would say, nothing I've done is worth anything. I haven't done anything. And I was like, that's not true. You've helped hundreds of people. You've studied the Bible with people. You've helped people become Christians. That's not real. That's not true. And what I would say to them is that's the depression talking. That's not a real thought. That's the illness talking to you. And that would help sometimes for them to be able to separate that thought, you know, from, and say, that isn't real. You know, no, that's not accurate. That's not an accurate thought. That's just part of the illness that I'm thinking those things. So sometimes that helps people to just know what you think about yourself is not real. That's just part of this disorder. That's part of this disorder. You know, we need to help Christians focus on what the Bible says about them. You know, that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, that they are children of God, you know, and these thoughts, they need to try to keep these thoughts at bay with those kind of scriptures, really hanging on with those scriptures, that's their true identity, not what this illness is telling them about themselves. You know, also, as Michael mentioned, depression, part of depression are these vegetative symptoms. You know, people, if you are clinically depressed as an adult, at least, it's a little bit different for kids and young people. But if you're clinically depressed as an adult, what you want to do is pull the cover up over your head and stay in bed all day. That's what you feel like doing. You don't have energy to get up and do anything. You're not interested in getting up and doing anything. You're not going to enjoy it when you do get up and do it. So you want to pull the cover up over your head. You know, that's what you feel like doing, but that actually makes the depression worse. You know, if somebody gives into those vegetative feelings, it actually makes the depression worse. You also want to isolate yourself from other people. You just don't have the energy sometimes to interact with other people. That makes the depression worse. So one thing we can do to help people is to get them up and get them active. You know, a lot of times I'll tell people when I'm dealing with someone that's depressed, I want you to get up and take a shower and have something to eat and go on a walk or meet somebody for coffee. Then if you have to come back later in the afternoon and go to your bedroom and lay down for a few minutes, that's fine. But at least I want you to get up and get going. You know, when we treat people in the hospital for depression, we put them on a very strict schedule like that to keep them active, because that actually makes the depression better. So does that make sense? So that's something you can encourage people to do. You know, with disciples who have bipolar disorder, like Michael said, they can be, the disorder can predispose them to these very impulsive behaviors. Sexual acting out, spending a lot of money, anger outbursts. Anger is a big one sometimes with bipolar disorder. You know, one way to help them is to talk with them and encourage them to stay compliant with their treatment. That really is, bipolar is a treatable disorder, but what makes it so hard to treat is this non-compliance that Michael talked about, that people will take themselves off their medications, and then we're back in the cycle again of bipolar disorder. You know, it's also helpful for them to have at least one or two close friends in church that they can talk to about how they're feeling and what they're being tempted with. and the people won't freak out about it, okay? Somebody needs to know that they're dealing with this disorder and that when they get tempted with something like this, they can go and get some help, have somebody hold them accountable. You know, a lot of times disciples who are bipolar, one of the things that they fret about is that they're not consistent in their prayer and Bible study. You know, I've sat with sisters who said, you know, I try to have a quiet time, but I can't concentrate. I can't read for an hour. You know, well, of course you can't. You know, your brain is worn out from this disorder that you're dealing with. You know, what I would help them to see is there's a difference between being consistent and being faithful in your relationship with God. You know, faithful in your relationship with God might be you take a 3x5 card and you write a verse that encourages you and you read it 5 times a day. That's your quiet time. That's being faithful in your relationship with God. Being faithful in your relationship with God is telling God how you're feeling today. You know, just talking with him about being real with God about how you're feeling. So, you know, try to help people move from this. Consistency is very hard when you're bipolar because your moods are changing all the time. So try to help people figure out how to be faithful to God during these times. Does that make sense? Now let me talk a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about studying the Bible with people who have mood disorders, or any of these disorders for that matter. One of the things we want to talk about, if you're studying the Bible with someone and they say, I have bipolar disorder, I have depression, I have an anxiety disorder, one of the things you might want to talk about is that disorder is not going to magically go away when they get baptized. You know, sometimes it's a conscious thought with people, sometimes it's just an unconscious thought. But having one of these disorders is miserable for people. People are suffering when they have these disorders. And a lot of times there's kind of this hope, like I said, it can be conscious or unconscious, that when I become a Christian, when I get baptized, this is going to magically go away. You know, so you need to address that with that person and say, you know, as you grow in your spiritual life, you know, as you deal with your sinful nature and things change as you're a Christian, might this get a lot better? Yes, indeed, it might get a lot better as you deal with the spiritual part of this, but it's not going to magically go away, all right? It's not going to be this instantaneous, you know, you get baptized and you're not depressed anymore. We went to a big service one time, and there were some college brothers baptizing one of their friends. And they got up to baptize this boy, and they said, you know, he's been on 3 different medications for depression, and he's throwing them all away today because he's making Jesus Lord of his life. And, you know, being a young Christian is hard enough. You don't want to set people up for failure like that. Now, that didn't happen. You know, wiser people intervened. That did not happen. But people can think that, you know, so you need to discuss that when you're studying the Bible with someone. With people who have bipolar disorder, if you're studying with someone with bipolar disorder, I recommend that you take it slowly. Because these disorders are cyclical, like Michael talked about, a person goes, you know, through a manic or hypomanic phase where they feel great and they're very enthused about everything, and then they hit this depression. And for some people, the cycle is very long. It might be days or weeks in this manic phase, and then days or weeks in this depressive phase. For some people, they cycle very quickly. There's what's called rapid cycling bipolar disorder, and their mood may change from hour to hour, even very quickly. What you don't want to do, if you're studying the Bible with someone who is bipolar, you want to help them understand what following Jesus is going to look like when they're feeling great in this manic phase, and when they're not feeling great in this depressive phase. So you don't want to, this is not somebody you want to baptize in 3 days, is what I'm saying. You know, you want to see how long these cycles are and help them understand what being faithful to God is going to mean for them in all of these moods that they have to deal with.
Mary is talking about rapid cycling bipolar. There's even a subtype called mixed, where you can have the mania and depression at the same time. So once again, if you look at this movie, Mr. Jones, there's this brief scene where they have a girl she's a patient in a psychiatric hospital, and she's talking manic, and then just crumbles into tears. So it's really devastating. It's a terrible illness, but also very interesting, I have to say. So that's mood disorders we've talked about, and that's not all of them by any means. We've talked about major depressive disorder, dysthymia, and bipolar disorder, but there are lots of others. But those are the ones you're most likely to see and most likely to hear about. So let's move on to anxiety disorders, and there's a bunch of those as well. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, PTSD, and OCD. Of those, generalized anxiety disorder is the most common. So generalized anxiety is worry, persistent worry about everything all the time, even illogical things. This is what bothers them, is because they realize that their worry is illogical. They're worried about stuff that is very, meteor falling on my head or, not likely to happen. And that just makes them more anxious and depressed because they know their worries are not sound, and they're concerned about it. Once again, my mother had a great capacity to worry about everything, but to her it was all rational. Of course you would worry about a meteor falling on someone's head because meteors are relatively prevalent, and we walk around without hats. So generalized anxiety is worry about everything almost all the time. You have to understand, with people like this, you can throw Matthew 6. What's Matthew 6? Do not worry. You can throw that at them all day till you're blue in the face, but they're not going to get anywhere until we relieve the symptoms and get the cloud off their head with medication. Now, here are some that we use for treating anxiety disorders. SSRIs are also good for anxiety. They have an anxiolytic or anti-anxiety component. So I was telling someone in the break, basically Prozac, if it swept your floor, you could use it for everything. It's a very useful medication. Wellbutrin is another one that is used for both depression and anxiety problems. Now, you take those every day, those medications at the top. The other ones, Klonopin and Xanax, are useful for another kind of disorder, which I'll go back in a second, but they're very addictive, so they have to be used sparingly and carefully. Those are called benzodiazepines. They have high addictive potential. Glenn is probably nodding his head back there. Panic disorder is when anxiety happens in a discrete, brief episode. And if you've ever studied the neurological system, you have a system in your body. You've heard of fight or flight system. It's a system made up of, from your brain to certain glands that secrete certain hormones that communicate with each other to prepare the body in times of danger to either fight the danger or run away from it. So it's a system of arousal. Your brain perceives a threat, and your brain sends a message to your adrenal glands, which are on the top of your kidney, to secrete cortisol, which is a stress hormone that gets your body tight and ready to go, and respiration going, heart rate going, shuts down all non-essential systems like your bowels, and gets you ready to either fight or run away from this danger. So it's a very useful system. However, in people with panic disorder, this system is triggered for no reason. So people have that same fight or flight reaction in response to nothing in particular, and they feel anxious, they feel the heart's racing. Panic attack is responsible for a high percentage of visits to emergency rooms every year because people feel like they're dying. Their heart's thumping away, and they're, sweating, and have feelings of impending doom. This is terrible. Everything's going to come to an end. So that's a panic attack. If you can weather it through, it will eventually go away. In fact, part of doing therapy, cognitive therapy with people with panic disorder, is to remind them, you've been through this before. Next time it happens, just tell yourself, I've been through this before, it'll go away. I just need to sit down, take deep breaths, calm myself down. So it's part of the therapy to teach them that it will go away at some point. But it's miserable while you have it. And that's when we use things like Klonopin and Xanax because they're useful to when you're having an episode, but you don't want to use them all the time because of their addictive potential. So that's panic disorder. See if I have anything to add about that. Now almost last, OCD. Here's another one that's greatly misunderstood by the media and by society. Now, everyone, you've probably called your spouse OCD, right? Everyone seems to think that if you're some kind of neatnik or you're really, you like keeping things really clean, you have OCD. No, that's not true. To have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, you have to have an obsessive thought. That's a recurrent thought, distressing thought, that you try to neutralize or counteract with a compulsive behavior. You have to have both of those, an obsessive thought that you can't get rid of, an anxiety-producing thought that you try to neutralize with a compulsive behavior. So there are many things, many of these obsessive-compulsive combinations. Popular one is hand washing, right? You've heard of that. So the obsessive thought is, everything I touch has germs, and germs will make you sick. That's your obsessive thought. And it's an anxious thought, and it makes you anxious, and you can't get rid of that thought. What you try to do is neutralize it with a compulsive action. I'm going to go wash my hands. So you wash your hands. The problem is, as soon as you leave the bathroom and you touch something, oh my goodness, I have germs again, because everything has germs. Now I got to go wash my hands again. So people with this hand washing compulsion have dry, cracked hands, and it's miserable, and it takes a lot of time out of their day. But there's other compulsions too. Locking is a popular one, where people are trying to go to bed at night, and they get in their little mind, did I lock all the doors? Because as you know, someone could break in and it would be dangerous. That's the anxiety-producing thought. So they go to every window and every door of the house, lock, lock, lock. Then they go back to bed, and a little anxiety-producing thought, did I really check the bathroom window? Because you know how that hinge, it tends to stick sometimes. So I got to get up and go check that again. And that can go on and on and on to the point of misery. I had a patient once whose anxiety-producing thought was, when he drove, he would hit people and hurt them without knowing it. So he'd be driving to work and hit a bump in the road, and he'd try to keep driving. He's like, maybe that was a person, and I just didn't see him. He'll stop his car. He'll go all the way back. He'll look around. Okay, I think we're good. Get back in his car, go 2 miles this time, and then say, but I didn't look in the gully. There was a gully right there, and I didn't really check that out well. So it's an obsessive thought with a compulsive action. There are ritualistic obsessive-compulsive pairs, like if I don't take 7 steps, or if the step on a crack, break your mother's back. There are people who actually, will avoid cracks in cement, because that's their anxiety-producing thought, and their compulsive action is to avoid. So there are things with certain numbers. I've got to wash this dish 7 times for it to be truly clean, and then put it down. Well, what if I just did 6? And now I got to start all over again. So obsessive-compulsive disorder is miserable. It takes control of people's lives, and it's a dominating, terrible force. Even kids have it. We have in our office, we have a book. We have therapeutic books we use for children, and one of them is the star of the book is called O.C. Flea, and you read this book, it's about animals on a farm, and this little flea that tells each of the animals an anxiety-producing thing. Like it tells the cow, the milk you gave today was contaminated with something. You drooled in it, and it's going to hurt people. So the cow gets all anxious, and it tells the pig something about, all the mud you wallow in. So it's really cute, and it's very to the point. You have these obsessive thoughts, and here's how you break the compulsive action. Once again, that's hard to do without medication. We usually talk about medication to break that cycle. You have this cycle, it's very hard to break. You take medications to relieve the symptoms. Then you use therapy to teach them how to train their minds to stop doing that. Rational thinking. All right, before you go to wash your hands again, now think this out. How many people do you know have died from touching something with germs on it? Yes, it's possible, but remotely, very, very much unlikely, so you're probably okay. So that's the therapy part of it. Now, if let me quickly talk about PTSD as well. Post-traumatic stress disorder is actually an anxiety disorder. Most people think PTSD, they think of veterans, right, who have been through a war, and now they're stressed out, and they they get depressed and anxious due to their experiences in the war. Now, here's an interesting fact. You can have PTSD from things other than wartime experience. I mean, there are traumatic things that happen, you get robbed, you get mugged, you get A parent dies, or there's a bunch of stressful things that can cause PTSD. In fact, by definition, you don't even have to have been there when it happened, and you can still have PTSD. You didn't have to be the victim. You could have witnessed it. So after 9/11, after people watched over and over and over again, watched the videos, there was this rash of PTSD all of a sudden. Now, to have PTSD, you have to have a bunch of specific symptoms. One is you have to have recurrent intrusive thoughts about the traumatic thing. Like, you can't get it out of your head, those towers caving in, or, seeing my buddies in wartime getting shot. So you have to have these intrusive thoughts, and you have to have what's called hypervigilance, which is when you're always on edge thinking it's going to happen again. So you have a vet, a wartime vet, who's always on the lookout and always hypervigilant, thinking something's going to happen. That way, when a car backfires, and you hear, they jump out of their skin. So PTSD, we can't just sling around as a common term. You really have to have some very specific symptoms to qualify for the diagnosis of PTSD. And it's very difficult to treat because it's associated with traumatic events, which are very hard for humans to get over with. Mary?
I hope, as we're talking about these things, I hope that we're helping you guys grow in compassion for people. People who have these disorders are suffering, are really suffering. Michael was talking about OCD. I saw a little boy, he was like 8 or 9 years old, and he had this obsessive thought that when he exhaled, his breath was poisonous to other people. So he couldn't go to school because he was afraid he was going to kill his classmates. He didn't want to be around his family because he was afraid he would kill his family. It was torment for him to sit in the therapy room with me. He would turn his head away. I mean, can you imagine living like that? So people with these disorders are suffering, and our brothers and sisters in the church who have these disorders are suffering. So, I just want us to grow in our compassion for people. With Christians who have anxiety disorders, one of the things that they struggle with is feeling very different from other people. Like Michael said, people with anxiety disorders, they know that what they're dealing with is not logical. This little boy knew that it wasn't logical, that his breath could kill people, but that's still the way he felt. That's still what he thought. But he knew it wasn't real, but he couldn't do anything about the thought going away. So they feel very different from other people. So one of the things that helps them is to have 1 or 2 other disciples that understand what this disorder is, and that they can talk to about what they're feeling and what they're thinking, and they don't sound weird. A lot of times, like in our home congregation, a lot of times we will kind of pair somebody like this up with like a nurse or somebody that's a medical professional that knows what these disorders are, so that if they say, I feel like, if I walk into church, there's germs all over me, that the other person doesn't think you're odd or you're crazy or anything. They understand that this is part of the disorder. People that have any of these disorders, any of these anxiety disorders, church attendance can be very difficult for them. For instance, with panic disorder, once somebody has had a panic attack, one of the anxiety-producing things for them is it's going to happen again someplace. So I don't want to go to the store because it might happen at the store. I don't want to go to church because I might have one in the middle of church. You understand? So going to church, being in a large crowd for folks that have anxiety disorders can be very, very hard. So we need to figure out, how can you do it? What can you manage? Can you manage sitting in the back row with one of your friends close? Can you manage, if it's very severe, can you manage just to come for communion and then go home and listen to the sermon online? What can you handle? And we need to be, again, we've got to be compassionate with where the person is, help them to understand they still need the body of Christ if they're going to do well spiritually, but what can you manage? What is that going to look like for you? And not do the, you have to be at every service and you have to stay the whole time until the last song thing. Make sense? Okay. We have a brother at church where we are, very talented man, very smart man, has a terrible anxiety disorder. And he has been a faithful disciple for longer than we have. He's been a disciple longer than we have. Sometimes he can come to church. He's a musician. You know, sometimes he feels good enough. He can get up and play on stage. Sometimes it may be 6 weeks that he can't come to church because the anxiety is so bad. So he calls Michael, and they talk on the phone. I mean, that's how he stays connected to the body, and he's got some other close friends, you know. So you got to help people do what they can do, you know, and be compassionate towards them.
Now, the other thing you can do is, I like to tell people, if you have an anxiety disorder is cause intrusive, anxious thoughts that you can't get rid of. Distraction is very therapeutic. So I tell people with anxiety disorders, doing something is better than doing nothing. Because if you stay home and do nothing, your mind is going to go down that rabbit hole of anxious thoughts, and you're just going to get worse. It's going to become a snowball effect. So helping them do anything instead of nothing that's distracting is very therapeutic. Even if it's something small, we're going to go out and help this one person, or, you know, we're just going to fix something for this sister in the congregation that can't, you know, just something, even for a short period of time. And then if it's an OCD problem, just remind them, you know, we've had people shadow people with OCD, walk with them, and when they feel like doing the compulsive behavior, they have someone right next to them that say, it's okay, you don't have to do this. You're not going to get infected with a disease. You're okay. Okay, I feel better. So there's plenty you can do. Like Mary said, I hope you're compassionate, and there's plenty you can do to help people like this. Now, last group of disorders we're going to cover, well, next to last, is the psychotic disorders. Let me tell you what the most familiar one is. First, schizophrenia is the one you're most familiar with, but all psychotic disorders are characterized by psychosis. Psychosis is a combination of hallucinations, either visual or auditory hallucinations, that's hearing things or seeing things that aren't there, or delusions. Delusions are a system of thought that the person thinks is real, but isn't real and can't possibly be real. So once again, all these disorders, all these psychotic disorders, are characterized by hallucinations and delusions. Now, there's lots of delusional thoughts are organized systems of thinking that are not based on reality, and there's lots of different kinds. You've heard of, for example, grandiose delusions, where someone is convinced that they are maybe the reincarnation of someone extremely, you know, like I'm Napoleon come back to life. I'm convinced of that, and I should be treated that way. So there's paranoid delusions, where you think everyone is out to get you and knows and is trying to mess with your mind. So people with paranoid delusions, they might be watching TV, a newscast, and say, you know, that he's talking to me. That's a code. He's sending a code to me about something. There's what's called erotomanic delusions, where you're convinced that someone is deeply in love with you, or that you have a connection that really isn't there. I had a patient who had an erotomanic delusion about Stevie Nicks from Fleetwood Mac, right? Stevie Nicks. So he was convinced that they were married, that they had this connection and were in fact spiritually married. And so in therapy, you don't confront someone head on with the unreality of their delusion and say, well, that's ridiculous. You know, you don't do that. That's very untherapeutic. So I said, tell me about that. I mean, she has a pretty busy work schedule. How do you all hook up, you know? And he says, it doesn't even have to be physical. I'll watch her in concert, and her smile is directed right to me, and I know that that's a reassurance that we're together, you know? So there's erotomanic delusions. There's all kind of different delusional systems. There's even religious delusions. There's something called scrupulosity, which is the delusion that you are constantly committing an unintentional sin. And no matter what you do, you're sinning. You don't know what it is, but I just am convinced that I just committed a sin. I'm not sure what it is, but God knows what it is, and I need to do penance for it or something like that. Now, some of you are thinking, well, that's interesting. I do that all the time. So we're going to hand out business cards and Risperdal at the end of this class. But they're incapacitating. Now, why are we even talking about people with psychotic disorders? Because believe it or not, you have them in your church. Schizophrenia is the most common. Schizoaffective disorder is kind of a combination of schizophrenia and depression. So it's psychotic episodes alternating with or coincident with depression. You have these people in your congregation, whether you know it or not. Now, I'm going to kind of branch off a little to another disorder, because once they're treated, schizophrenia is a chronic but treatable disorder. If you stay on your antipsychotic medication, and there are a bunch of them, Mellaril, Risperdal, there's a bunch of them, Remeron, it's manageable. It's a manageable disorder. However, on medication, people with psychotic disorders are very similar to people with another kind of disorder called autism spectrum disorder, which you've heard of, right? And we usually consider that a childhood disorder. Autism is on a spectrum. We used to think of autism just as severely autistic impaired kids who don't communicate and they do stereotypic behavior and rock back and forth and so forth. We now know that autism is on a broad spectrum. And there are plenty of really high-functioning people, in fact, brilliant, genius people, who are on that autism spectrum. The thing they have in common with people who are schizophrenic is trouble with social interaction. So adults especially, adults on the autism spectrum, they don't understand, they may be perfectly brilliant and smart, but they don't understand social cues and social nuance. And they don't understand how they're coming off to other people. They can't really know what it's like to be in someone else's shoes and perceive how they're. So these people in your congregations kind of look the same and have a hard time relating to the congregation. There's a brother in church that we know, in fact, everyone in his family is schizophrenic. It's very deep in the family. And we have to help him. He kind of lurks, you know. It's very hard for him to interact with people, to look them in the eye, to have a convivial conversation. He kind of lurks around. So we try to keep someone on point with him. Does that make sense? You know, we try to pair, so people on the spectrum or people with schizophrenia, we try to pair them with somebody else who will take point with them and kind of accompany them and help them. If we can get them to form one reasonably close personal relationship with somebody else, a brother or a sister, we're doing good. Now, periodically, I'll say as an elder in the church, this brother with schizophrenia, every once in a while he'll call me to a meeting and we'll go to lunch together. And one time he brought out a scroll, literally a scroll that he had written, with all the offenses he felt had been perpetrated against him by individuals in the congregation. And this scroll was enormous. Most of it was delusional. You know, no, the person didn't really mean that when he said that, or no, that's not what happened. It was, but this is something we have to deal with all the time. So they can be kind of disruptive to the church, but it's best to, like I said, we try to, and the commonality between people with psychotic disorders and autistic spectrum disorder people are this restricted interests, They may talk on and on about something that means nothing to you or is not interesting to you, and they don't understand why it's not interesting to you, so they have trouble relating to other people. Mary?
I'm just going to reiterate what he just said. Maintaining relationships, positive relationships, is really the hardest thing for people with psychotic disorders or on the spectrum. As a ministry leader, if you're a ministry leader, again, you want to try to help these people get connected with just one or two other people in the congregation that understand what they're dealing with. And the thing you don't want to do, you know how in our churches, like every 6 months, we take our family groups or our small groups or Bible talks or whatever you call them, and we mix them all up, That's what you don't want to do with these people, all right? If they're in a family group or a Bible talk and they're doing well, they stay in that family group until Jesus comes back, all right? They don't get moved around when everybody gets moved around, okay? Because the relationship, maintaining a relationship is very difficult for them. Or if you move them, you make sure that that person that they're connected with moves with them. Does that make sense? Okay? So we've got to understand that that's so difficult for them to build these kind of relationships that we can't mix them up all the time like we do a lot of times. Let me just say a word about studying the Bible with someone with a psychotic disorder. You've just got to make sure that they're really understanding what being a disciple means, all right? That they're really clear enough in their thinking to get what it means to follow Jesus. And it may be a simplified version of what you study with everybody else. They don't need to go through the prophecies in Daniel, okay? That's not where you want to go with someone with a psychotic disorder. You want them to understand that they need Jesus, that they have a sinful nature that they're going to have to deal with, and that they need the body around them to do well spiritually. One time I was called into a study. There were some sisters, and they had been studying with a woman that had told them, you know, I have some psychiatric problems. And they said, you know, we're just not getting anywhere. We're studying every week, and she wants to study every week, and we're just not getting anywhere. So could you come in? So I went in, and, you know, they were studying about discipleship or something, and the lady was actually hallucinating while they were doing the study. You know, she was actually hearing voices and talking to people while they were doing the study. You know, at that point, you stop everything, and you do one or two scriptures about Jesus, and you wait until that person is clear enough to understand. Does that make sense? Okay. The other thing I just wanted to say, as we're talking about these disorders, none of these disorders disqualifies anyone from being an awesome, faithful disciple. We know people who have all of these disorders that have been disciples for years, faithful disciples to Jesus for years. So please don't feel like this disqualifies anyone from being a disciple.
That's right. In fact, that's strength in Mary's and my faith, is to see people with disorders that even in the psychiatric community are considered death sentences. You know, this is an intractable disorder. This is never going to get better. You know, I'll treat you, but it'll be for the rest of your life. And we have seen people, you know, turn around. Now, they may struggle with this disorder, yes, for the rest of their life, but they do much better than anyone would have predicted. And they become productive and fruitful. And so that has strengthened our faith for all these years. One more group of disorders that bears discussion, that you don't hear much about anywhere, but it bears mentioning, are what are called the personality disorders. Now, they're different from everything we've been talking about because personality disorders are not considered neurochemical or structural, not having to do with the structure of the brain or the chemistry of the brain. Personality disorders are caused by, the things you've gone through as a child has caused your personality to form with some what we call maladaptive traits. In other words, you've developed personality traits that's going to make it very hard for you to relate to your environment and get by in society. So they're hard to treat because they're, like I said, they're not usually chemical or neurological in nature. They're personality disorders. The other thing that makes them hard to treat is people with personality disorders. All these other disorders we've been talking about, if you have one, you know it, and you don't want it, and it bothers you, so you seek treatment. People with personality disorders, they're fine. It's the rest of the world that's screwy. And so they have no motivation to seek treatment, usually unless they're made to for some reason or another, because they don't realize that there's a problem. And there's a bunch they're in what we call clusters, but so once again, they're more like personality types. Maladaptive personality types, and there's a bunch of them. Paranoid personality disorder is when it's when you're distrustful. You're not acutely paranoid, where you think you're not delusional. You don't think you're hearing voices over the radio or anything like that, but you're distrustful of everybody. No one is to be trusted. They're xenophobic. You know, anyone from any other country, any other race is not to be trusted. Schizoid personality is someone with an aversion to human contact and emotion. They are indifferent to the affections of others. They don't need human contact. They're the ones that end up being, you know, hermits up on mountaintops and are fine with that. They have an aversion to human emotions and human contact. Schizotypal is similar to that, but people with schizotypal disorder, not only are they aversive to human contact, but they also believe in things like extrasensory things and some mystical things. They have some kind of delusional thinking. Antisocial disorder are what commonly called a sociopath. It's someone who can get by and might even be very socially adept or socially facile, but they only use people. Their whole goal is to use people for their own means. Okay. Mary told me not to say anything political or to talk about politics or anyone in our government, so I'm not gonna say anything about political leaders who show such characteristics. So let's take mafia leaders, okay? They can be charming. You watch The Sopranos, okay? That's safe ground, right? You watch Tony Soprano. He can be charming. He can lead you to believe that you're his best friend and that he trusts you, but if it serves his purpose, he'll slit your throat in a second. That happened in season 3 sometime. So that's what antisocial personality disorder is. They're very socially adept, but they're only using people. Histrionic personality is when someone always has to be the center of attention and thrive on being the center of attention, but they don't earn it. Their relationships are very superficial, and they get indignant if they're not the center of attention. Narcissistic personality, narcissist self-love. Narcissistic personality are people who think they deserve to be treated special because they are special. And they're better than other people, and they're deserving of different, circumstances, different treatment. There's avoidant personality, which is people who don't want to take any chances. They're socially inhibited. They resist social contact because it's too risky. Dependent personality is someone who they don't make any decisions on their own. They're very dependent on other people. Should I do this? How do I do that? So they've got to have somebody. They're very dependent on someone to help them get through every decision of the day. There's obsessive compulsive personality. Remember when we were talking about neatniks? This is different from obsessive compulsive disorder. Someone with obsessive compulsive personality is very precise, very bound to rules. Rules mean everything. And they set extremely high standards, not only for other people, but for themselves. So that when they can't attain their own high level of standards, they're down on themselves and angry at themselves. And they're perfectionistic. They work hard and never take a vacation because to do that would be a sign of human failing. So yeah, okay, all right, you're looking at maybe a poster child for, So, for example, I'll just digress. My desk, if you look at my desk at the office, and my bookshelf, to keep me from feeling frazzled or like my world is falling apart, everything on my desk is in a specific place. Every book on my bookshelf is the same book in the same place as it has been for years. And if you alter anything on my desk or in my bookshelf, I'll know it. Oh yeah, I'll walk in my office and I'll smell it. Something here is changed. That book has been pulled out or moved. And it's my way of keeping myself from feeling like my whole world is flying apart. I've got to have this on my desk right here, and no clutter on my desk, and this on my desk right here. So, personal confession, obsessive compulsive personality. The last one, borderline, I put it by itself because it is the grandfather of all personality disorders and the most destructive and the hardest to treat, and there is a lot of it going on in our family of churches. It's almost as if you could wrap everything we've talked about so far this morning and condense it into one disorder. It would be borderline personality. People with borderline personality, it's characterized by very unstable relationships and very unstable self-image. So what usually happens is this. Someone with borderline personality is constantly looking for validation. So if you're a ministry leader, the borderline personality person will be their savior. Oh, minister, it's so nice. You're awesome. It's so nice. I'm so glad you're here. You're speaking directly to me. You are what I've been looking for my whole life. Your teachings are what I've craved. It's the best I've ever heard. Or doctor, you're the one, I've gone from doctor to doctor, you're the only one who understands me. Build you up on a pedestal. But as soon as you do one thing that they will personalize, that pedestal falls quickly. If you're 1 minute late for an appointment, you're just like everyone else. I knew it. You're just like everyone else. You turn your back on me at the first, I'm going to kill myself. Because and so they manipulate with threats of suicide. That's a really common thing. Borderlines in a church will get everybody around them stirred up, chasing their tail, calling their discipler at 3 a.m. Do you really love me? Do you really love me like the Bible says you're supposed to love me? If you don't answer that phone, you're just like everyone else, and you validate their own, So they will get everyone stirred up around them, chasing their tails to help them, while they kind of sit back, not manipulatively, it's just their way. So borderlines will cut a path of destruction like Hurricane Harvey through a church, where there's people upset, people trying to help them, people, and we've seen them commandeer the resources of an entire church until someone draws a line. Now, the way borderlines in the world of psychiatry, most of our colleagues won't treat borderlines because they're so demanding, or they'll take one borderline at a time. So they're very, and they will latch on to lead people in leadership positions. So I'm just saying, this is something to, now don't go home to your home church and say, hey, I just found out you're borderline. And that's why you're causing so much problem. But I'm just saying, if you've had someone like that has disrupted an entire church and gotten people, caused divisions and factions and things like that, sometimes it's a borderline. The way you deal with borderlines is boundaries. The only psychiatrists and psychologists I know that deal effectively with borderlines set firm boundaries. This is what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to answer any calls from you after 11 o'clock. I don't care if you're suicidal. Don't tell me about it. Go to the hospital. I'm not going to respond to that. Firm boundaries. I still love you, but no, I'm not going to prove it by, driving through a blizzard at, 2 a.m. to help you when you're. So setting very clear boundaries and firm boundaries is the best way to handle people with borderlines. So just for something for you to be aware of. That concludes our discussion of a very few of the manifold mental disorders that we could have talked about. But as I said, these are the ones you're most likely to see. So thank you for your attention. Let's take a 5-minute break. Maybe, but, it's interesting.